The Soviet flag descended from the Kremlin for the final time on December 25, 1991. And with it fell not just a nation, but an entire way of imagining the world. 70 years of ideology, sacrifice, and global influence dissolved in a matter of months, leaving historians to puzzle over a question that still echoes through our understanding of power itself. Can a superpower die not from conquest or revolution, but from simply ceasing to believe in its own legitimacy? The fall of the Soviet Union represents one of history's most peculiar collapses, a nuclear-armed empire that disintegrated not with violence, but with a collective shrug. What killed it was not external invasion, but an internal crisis of faith so profound that, when the end came, almost nobody lifted a finger to prevent it. To understand this extraordinary ending, we must first understand the illusion that preceded it. The Soviet Union did not always appear as a doomed experiment. In the decades following World War II, it seemed to many observers that communism might actually represent humanity's future. The Red Army had crushed Nazi Germany, absorbing casualties that would have broken lesser nations. Soviet tanks rolled through Eastern Europe, and by the early 1960s, the hammer and sickle flew over territories stretching from the Elbe River to the Pacific Ocean. When Nikita Khrushchev banged his shoe on the desk at the United Nations and declared, "We will bury you," it did not sound like empty rhetoric. It sounded like a prediction. The space race crystallized this sense of Soviet ascendancy. On October 4, 1957, Sputnik's radio signal pierced through the atmosphere, announcing to the world that the Soviet Union had achieved something the capitalist West had not. The psychological impact of that beeping satellite cannot be overstated. It suggested that central planning could out-innovate market economies, that collective effort could triumph over individualism, that perhaps Marx had been right after all about the inevitable progression of history. When Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in 1961, the victory seemed complete. The future, it appeared, spoke Russian. This was the image the Soviet Union projected, and in many ways it believed its own propaganda. The system offered its citizens a compelling social contract: surrender political freedom and accept material limitations, but receive in return guaranteed employment-free healthcare, subsidized housing, and the pride of belonging to a superpower that had defeated fascism and challenged American hegemony. For millions who remembered the devastation of the war, who had lost family members to German occupation, this seemed like a reasonable bargain. The Soviet identity became wrapped in narratives of collective sacrifice, technological achievement, and moral superiority over the decadent West. But beneath the May Day parades and the propaganda posters, a different reality was taking shape. The command economy that had successfully mobilized resources for war and heavy industrialization was proving spectacularly ill-suited for producing consumer goods or sustaining long-term growth. Gazprom, the Central Planning Agency, attempted something that economic theory suggested was impossible: replacing the price mechanism with bureaucratic calculation. In market economies, prices aggregate information from millions of transactions, signaling scarcity and abundance, guiding production and consumption through a decentralized process that no single mind can comprehend. The Soviet system tried to replace this organic information processor with committees of planners who would decide how many shoes, how much bread, how many tractors the entire nation needed. The Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek had predicted this would fail, arguing that rational economic calculation required market prices. Without them, planners were flying blind, making decisions based on political considerations rather than economic reality. The result was predictable: chronic shortages of consumer goods alongside massive waste in industrial production. Factories produced goods nobody wanted because the plan demanded quantity over quality. Agricultural output stagnated despite enormous investments because collective farms lacked the incentive structures that made farming efficient. The Soviet Union, blessed with some of the richest agricultural land on Earth, became dependent on grain imports from its ideological enemy. The system developed elaborate mechanisms of self-deception. Factory managers learned to report fictitious production figures to meet planned quotas. Regional party bosses inflated their achievements to advance their careers. The Potemkin village, the fake prosperous settlement, allegedly built to impress. Catherine the Great became a metaphor for the entire Soviet project. At every level, people performed success rather than achieving it because the system punished honesty more than it rewarded genuine accomplishment. This created what psychologists call cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. Soviet citizens took pride in their nation's superpower status. While standing in line for hours to buy basic goods, they celebrated technological triumphs while living in crumbling apartment blocks with unreliable electricity. They believed, or pretended to believe, in the superiority of socialism while quietly envying Western standards of living. The contrast with other post-war recoveries illuminates the Soviet system's fundamental problems. Japan and West Germany, devastated by the same war, rebuilt their economies through very different mechanisms. They embraced market principles while maintaining strong social safety nets. They focused on export competitiveness and technological innovation. They created legal frameworks that encouraged entrepreneurship and foreign investment. By the 1970s, both had achieved standards of living that eclipsed the Soviet Union's. Despite starting from positions of near total destruction, the Soviet Union had won the war but was losing the peace. The 1970s brought temporary relief in the form of soaring oil prices. The Arab oil embargo and subsequent energy crisis sent petroleum prices skyrocketing, and the Soviet Union, sitting on vast reserves, suddenly found itself flush with hard currency. This windfall had a paradoxical effect. It masked the system's underlying problems while making them worse. The petrodollars flowing into Soviet coffers reduced the urgency of economic reform. Why restructure a failing system when oil revenues can paper over the cracks? This phenomenon, which economists call the resource curse or Dutch disease, has plagued many nations blessed with natural resources. The easy money from commodity exports discourages the development of other economic sectors and insulates governments from the need to maintain productive, diversified economies, but the oil boom created a dangerous dependency. By the early 1980s, energy exports accounted for roughly 70% of Soviet hard currency earnings. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, driven partly by increased production elsewhere and partly by reduced demand, following the economic shocks of the previous decade, the Soviet budget went into crisis. Unlike resource-rich nations with diversified economies or sovereign wealth funds, the Soviet Union had no cushion. It had spent the windfall on maintaining an unsustainable military, propping up failing industries, and subsidizing allied regimes from Cuba to Vietnam. When the money stopped flowing, the entire edifice began to crack. The Afghanistan invasion, launched with confidence in December 1979, became another hemorrhaging wound. What Soviet planners imagined would be a quick intervention to stabilize a friendly government turned into a brutal counterinsurgency that consumed resources and lives for nearly a decade. Over $50 billion spent, 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, tens of thousands more returning home physically wounded or psychologically scarred. The parallels to America's Vietnam experience were not lost on Soviet citizens, particularly the educated classes who accessed information through underground networks. But there was a crucial difference in how the two systems processed failure. In democracies, failed wars generate public protest, media criticism, and political accountability. These painful mechanisms allow for course correction, however belated. Authoritarian systems lack these feedback loops. The Soviet state could suppress open dissent, but it could not suppress the quiet demoralization spreading through the military and the population. The returning soldiers became vectors of disillusionment. They had seen the incompetence of military leadership, the gulf between propaganda and reality, the futility of trying to impose ideology through force. They returned to a society where speaking such truths openly remained dangerous, so the disillusionment remained largely private, but it accumulated. Each personal revelation of system failure became a small psychological withdrawal from the collective project. The social contract political obedience in exchange for security and pride was breaking down. Meanwhile, technological change was exposing the command economy's structural inability to innovate. The 1970s and 1980s saw the emergence of personal computing, telecommunications breakthroughs, and the early stages of what would become the information revolution. These developments highlighted a paradox about Soviet capabilities. The USSR could build rockets that reached orbit, nuclear weapons that threatened global annihilation, and military hardware that matched or exceeded Western equivalents in certain categories. This was because the command economy excelled at concentrating resources on narrowly defined priorities where performance could be easily measured. Rocket payload capacity is quantifiable. Military applications are fundable at any cost. But the command economy failed utterly at producing consumer electronics, software innovation, or the kind of incremental improvements that make technology useful for ordinary people. The reasons were structural. Innovation in consumer technology requires rapid experimentation, failure tolerance, and close feedback from users, everything the Soviet system was designed to prevent. Silicon Valley's success came from garage startups, venture capital risk-taking, and a culture that celebrated creative destruction. The Soviet system offered none of these. It could copy Western technology, often skillfully, but it could not generate the organic innovation ecosystem that produces breakthrough after breakthrough. There was a tragic irony in this failure. Soviet scientists had been pioneers in cybernetics, the study of information and control systems, in the 1950s and 1960s. Some Soviet thinkers explored whether computers might solve the calculation problem that plagued central planning. If the issue was information processing, perhaps advanced computing could succeed where human planners failed. But these explorations ran into ideological obstacles. Cybernetics implied that systems operated according to laws independent of Marxist theory. It suggested that information and feedback mattered more than class struggle. By the time the political constraints eased, the technological gap had become unbridgeable. The personal computer revolution was happening in California, not Leningrad. The Brezhnev era embodied the system's sense. The average age of Politburo members crept into the 70s. These were men who had come of age during Stalin's terror, survived World War II, and spent their entire careers navigating Soviet bureaucracy. They understood power in traditional terms: military strength, ideological conformity, personal loyalty networks. They could not comprehend the world that was emerging, where economic dynamism and technological innovation determined geopolitical influence more than tank divisions. Beneath this gerontocracy, a generation of younger technocrats was coming to awareness. They could see the system was failing, but they were trapped within it, performing belief in an ideology many had privately abandoned. This generated what the political scientist Timur Kuran calls preference falsification, the gap between what people publicly express and what they privately believe. In the Soviet context, this gap became a chasm. People went through the motions of communist ritual, attending party meetings, mouthing ideological slogans, voting unanimously in uncontested elections, while privately cynical. The black market flourished because the official economy could not provide political jokes circulated cautiously, each one a small act of private rebellion. The samizdat networks passed forbidden literature from hand to hand, creating underground communities of shared doubt. The psychological toll of this sustained performance was profound. When people must constantly police their own expressions, when every conversation might be reported, when even family members could be informers, trust erodes and civic life withers. The social fabric became a web of mutual suspicion, masked by public conformity. This was learned helplessness on a societal scale, the condition psychologists observe when individuals repeatedly experience situations where their actions have no effect on outcomes. People stopped trying to improve things because trying was pointless. The system was immovable, or so it seemed. The death of Konstantin Chernenko in March 1985 marked the symbolic end of the old guard. 3 Soviet leaders had died in quick succession: Brezhnev in 1982, Andropov in 1984, Chernenko in 1985. If the system itself were dying by installments, the Politburo turned to Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, the youngest member of the leadership, a man who represented a different generation's hopes, Gorbachev recognized that the system was failing. Unlike his predecessors, he believed it could be reformed, that socialism could be saved through careful modification. This belief would prove spectacularly wrong, but his intentions were genuine. He wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, not destroy it. History would grant him the opposite of his wishes. Gorbachev's reform blueprint rested on 2 pillars: perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost, opening political discourse. The economic reforms aimed at introducing limited market mechanisms while maintaining socialism's core. The political opening would allow criticism of past mistakes and current problems, generating public participation in reform. In theory, these changes would revitalize socialism by correcting its worst excesses. In practice, they exposed the system's fundamental illegitimacy and accelerated its collapse. The comparison with China's reforms illuminates why Deng Xiaoping, who launched China's economic opening in 1978, took the opposite approach. He permitted radical economic experimentation while maintaining tight political control. Chinese farmers got private plots and market incentives before anyone got free speech. Special economic zones tested capitalism before anyone questioned Communist Party rule. By the time Gorbachev began his reforms, China had already demonstrated that market mechanisms could coexist with authoritarian politics. But Gorbachev made the crucial error of sequencing. He opened political discourse before delivering economic improvements. The economist Janos Kornai has analyzed why partial market reforms often fail in socialist systems. The problem is that half measures create contradictions worse than pure command economies. If some prices are freed but others controlled, if some enterprises face market competition while others receive state subsidies, if private initiative is permitted but property rights remain insecure, the result is chaos. Everyone game the system. Nobody knows the rules. Economic actors face perverse incentives that destroy productivity rather than enhancing it. Gorbachev's perestroika fell into precisely this trap. It disrupted the old system without creating a functional new one. Then came Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, releasing radioactive contamination across Europe. The Soviet government's initial response was reflexive dishonesty. They denied the accident, suppressed information, and delayed evacuation. But the radiation cloud could not be hidden. Swedish monitoring stations detected it, Western media reported it. The gap between official denial and observable reality became impossible to maintain. When Gorbachev finally addressed the disaster weeks later, the damage to Soviet credibility was irreversible. Chernobyl became a metaphor for the entire system. The accident happened because of design flaws the authorities had ignored, safety protocols that existed on paper but not in practice, and a culture where reporting problems endangered careers. The cover-up attempt revealed that even in matters of life and death, the system prioritized image over truth, and the delayed response demonstrated that the government valued its own credibility more than its citizens' safety. For millions of Soviet citizens, Chernobyl shattered whatever remained of their faith in the system's competence or honesty. Glasnost then opened the floodgates. Once media restrictions eased, journalists began reporting stories that had been suppressed for decades. The extent of Stalin's purges became public knowledge. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which carved up Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, were revealed. The Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces executed thousands of Polish officers and blamed the Nazis, was finally acknowledged. Each revelation further demolished the official historical narrative that had sustained Soviet legitimacy. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine building your entire worldview around certain fundamental truths. The Communist Party saved Russia from fascism. Stalin was a harsh but necessary leader. The Soviet Union represented progress toward human liberation. Then discovering those truths were lies. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. People had sacrificed for these beliefs. They had informed on neighbors, accepted deprivation, surrendered freedom, all for a cause that turned out to be built on mass murder and deception. The revelation of historical crimes did not just change people's view of the past, it destroyed their trust in present authority. The nationalist movements that emerged were both cause and consequence of this legitimacy collapse. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which had been forcibly annexed in 1940, led the resistance. The Singing Revolution, as it came to be called, weaponized culture against political power. Mass singing festivals became protests. Folk songs became declarations of independence. This was nonviolent resistance conducted through cultural assertion, and it proved impossible for the Soviet state to suppress without massive violence that would further destroy whatever legitimacy remained. Ukraine, Georgia, and other republics followed suit, each reclaiming national identities that decades of Russification had failed to erase. The Soviet Union had always been a prison of nations, held together by force and ideology. When both weakened simultaneously, the centrifugal forces became irresistible. The Communist Party had positioned itself as the guarantor of order and unity. As it lost credibility, the question arose, why should these nations remain united under Moscow's rule? the economic situation deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. Perestroika's half reforms created the worst of both worlds. The old command system was disrupted, but no new market system replaced it. Store shelves emptied. The black market exploded, growing larger than the official economy. Inflation accelerated. The state budget deficit reached 10% of GDP by 1989. Workers stayed on enterprise payrolls, but had nothing to buy with their wages. The social contract had completely collapsed. The system no longer provided security or pride. Argentina's economic crises offer an instructive parallel. When governments lose fiscal discipline, when deficits spiral, when people lose confidence in the currency and the institutions that manage it, economic collapse becomes self-fulfilling. People hoard goods, anticipating shortages. They convert currency to tangible assets, accelerating inflation. They withdraw from civic participation, undermining collective solutions. The Soviet Union in the late 1980s exhibited all these symptoms. The economy was failing because people had stopped believing in it, and people stopped believing because the economy was failing. Then Gorbachev made another crucial decision. In December 1988, addressing the United Nations, he announced the Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily to maintain communist governments in Eastern Europe. This renunciation of the Brezhnev Doctrine removed the threat that had kept the Iron Curtain in place. If East European nations chose different paths, Soviet tanks would not roll. The implications were staggering. Throughout 1989, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed like dominoes. Poland held semi-free elections in June. Hungary opened its border with Austria in September. The Berlin Wall fell in November, not destroyed by hammers but rendered obsolete by policy. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution succeeded in December. Romania's dictator was executed by Christmas. The entire Soviet bloc, built over 40 years, dissolved in 6 months. And the Soviet military, which had crushed Hungarian and Czech reforms in previous decades, stood by and did nothing. This passivity revealed the psychological surrender at the heart of the system's collapse. The Soviet Union still possessed overwhelming military force. It could have crushed the Eastern European movements, but doing so would have required convictions the leadership no longer held. Gorbachev believed in the righteousness of his reforms and saw Eastern European liberation as consistent with his vision of reformed socialism. The military and KGB, though many officers were hardliners, lacked the political consensus to act without clear orders, and the broader elite had lost faith in the ideology that justified such violence. This is where the psychological dimension becomes inseparable from the economic and political. A political system can survive economic hardship if its rulers believe in their right to rule and are willing to use force to maintain power. The Soviet Union in 1989 still had the capacity for repression. What it lacked was the will. The legitimacy vacuum was not just among the population but within the ruling elite itself. When rulers lose confidence in their own right to govern, when they can no longer justify repression even to themselves, the system becomes hollow. The comparison to other revolutionary moments is striking. In 1789, the French aristocracy could not bring itself to use full force against the Third Estate. In 1917, the Tsarist government lost the will to govern even before it lost the capacity. In 1979, the Shah's military refused to fire on demonstrators en masse, despite having the weapons to do so. In each case, the psychological surrender of the ruling class preceded and enabled the actual collapse. The Soviet Union followed this pattern. The August 1991 coup attempt, when hardliners tried to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, failed not because they lacked tanks, but because no one was willing to die for the old system. The coup plotters could not even convince the military to fire on crowds. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, became the image of this psychological shift. Here was the president of the Russian Republic, technically subordinate to the Soviet government, defying a coup by the Soviet security apparatus. His courage mattered, but more important was the fact that the soldiers in the tanks sided with him. The military and security services, theoretically the backbone of Soviet power, chose not to defend the system. This was not mutiny. Exactly, it was more profound than that. It was a collective realization that the system was no longer worth preserving, even by those whose careers and identities were most invested in it. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who had tried to save socialism, resigned as president of a country that ceased to exist. The formal end came with remarkable speed and surprisingly little violence. From superpower to dissolution took only 6 years. From Gorbachev's accession to final collapse was just over 6 years. The rapidity is itself revealing. Truly resilient systems don't disintegrate that quickly. The speed of collapse indicated the fragility that had existed beneath the surface all along. The comparison to other rapid imperial collapses, the Habsburg Empire after World War I, the Qing dynasty in China, the Ottoman Empire, reveals common patterns. All were multi-ethnic empires held together by traditional authority that had lost legitimacy. All faced economic pressures they could not manage. All attempted reforms that exposed contradictions rather than resolving them. And all discovered that once the performance of power ceased, there was nothing substantial beneath it. So we return to the central question: was this an economic collapse or a psychological surrender? The answer is that the dichotomy is false. The economic and psychological dimensions were inseparably intertwined in a feedback loop. The command economy's fundamental inefficiency created material failures that undermined legitimacy. The loss of legitimacy made economic reform impossible because reforms require trust, patience, and collective effort, all of which had been exhausted. The economy failed because people stopped believing in it, and people stopped believing because the economy failed. Consider the economic factors in isolation: the command economy's calculation problem, the oil dependency, the Afghanistan spending, the inability to compete in information technology. These were real material constraints that would have challenged any system, but they were not insurmountable. Nations have recovered from worse economic situations. Post-war Japan and Germany rebuilt from rubble. China, in 1978, was poorer and more isolated than the Soviet Union in 1985. The economic problems were severe, but not necessarily fatal. Now consider the psychological factors: the loss of elite faith in the ideology, Gorbachev's revelations of historical crimes, the nationalist awakening in the republics, the preference cascade when hidden dissent became public. These too were real phenomena that destabilized the system. But authoritarian regimes can survive widespread public cynicism if the ruling elite remains cohesive and willing to use force. China's Communist Party has maintained power despite presiding over the abandonment of Maoist economics, and despite widespread public cynicism about ideology. The Soviet collapse required both dimensions. Material failure destroyed legitimacy, and loss of legitimacy prevented the reforms that might have addressed material failure. Gorbachev's crucial error was attempting transparency before delivering economic improvements. He revealed the system's illegitimacy before demonstrating that reformed socialism could work. This sequencing killed the Soviet Union. Had he taken the Chinese path, economic reform first, political opening later, or never, the outcome might have been different. But such a course would have required a cynicism Gorbachev lacked. He genuinely believed in socialism and thought honesty would strengthen it. This principled mistake proved fatal. The self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic that emerged in the late Soviet period illustrates how economic systems depend on collective belief. Once enough people expect an economic system to fail, their rational responses to that expectation guarantee the failure. If you expect shortages, you hoard. If you expect currency collapse, you convert savings to tangible assets. If you expect the system to collapse, you prepare for the aftermath rather than trying to preserve what exists. The Soviet Union, in its final years, experienced exactly this dynamic. Each person's rational preparation for collapse accelerated the collapse itself. This explains why some Russians, despite living through the Soviet collapse, now feel nostalgia for it. The nostalgia is not for the shortages or the repression, but for the sense of purpose and certainty that came from believing in something larger than individual advancement. The post-Soviet transition was chaotic and traumatic. State assets were looted by well-connected insiders who became oligarchs overnight. Life expectancy dropped, crime soared, the social safety net disintegrated. For many, particularly older citizens who had built their identities around Soviet values, the transition felt like a betrayal. The past's stability, even if based on illusion, seemed preferable to the present's disorder. But nostalgia distorts memory. The Soviet Union did not collapse because foreign enemies destroyed it or because traitors betrayed it. It collapsed because the system could not deliver on its promises. And when honesty finally arrived, the gap between promise and reality proved unbridgeable. The final lesson is that no political system can survive the complete loss of legitimacy, and legitimacy requires more than force. It requires some alignment between what the system claims to be and what it actually delivers. The Soviet Union claimed to be creating a workers' paradise, a society without exploitation, a future of abundance and human liberation. What it delivered was chronic shortage, political repression, and technological stagnation. For decades, it could maintain the gap through propaganda, isolation, and coercion. But when Gorbachev opened the windows and let reality in, the illusion could not be maintained. The system did not just lose the economic competition with capitalism, it lost the argument that there was a viable alternative to open societies and market economies. The universal lessons extend beyond Soviet history. Any system that cannot process negative feedback is vulnerable to catastrophic failure. The Soviet Union lacked mechanisms for course correction because political survival required perpetuating myths. The system punished truth-tellers and rewarded yes-men. This created an information ecosystem where leaders made decisions based on fantasy rather than reality. By the time accurate information reached the top, it was too late to act on it effectively. Modern parallels abound, though we must be careful about drawing overly direct comparisons. Democratic resilience depends on maintaining institutions that process dissent and enable course correction. Economic systems require some mechanism for matching resources to needs, whether through markets or other means. Institutional trust matters because without it, collective action becomes impossible. These are not unique Soviet problems. They are universal challenges of governance and social organization. The Soviet collapse also illuminates the limits of ideology when it conflicts with observable reality. Human beings can tolerate cognitive dissonance for extended periods, but eventually the gap between belief and experience becomes unbearable. When what people experience daily contradicts what they are told to believe, either the beliefs must change or the evidence of experience must be suppressed. The Soviet Union tried suppression for decades, and it worked until it didn't. The moment Gorbachev eased the suppression, the beliefs collapsed with astonishing speed. This reveals something profound about the nature of power. Power is not just military force or economic resources or institutional position. It is the capacity to shape how people understand reality. When that capacity fails, when the official narrative loses credibility, other forms of power become difficult to exercise. The Soviet military could not suppress nationalist movements effectively because neither the soldiers nor their commanders believed in the right of Moscow to rule these nations by force. The party could not maintain discipline because party members themselves had stopped believing in the ideology. Power ultimately requires legitimacy, and legitimacy requires some correspondence to truth. The Soviet Union did not just lose the Cold War in conventional terms. It lost the argument about how societies should be organized, how economies should function, how political systems should operate. The collapse demonstrated that command economies cannot outcompete market systems in generating sustained prosperity. It showed that authoritarian systems that prevent feedback and suppress dissent become brittle and prone to sudden failure. It revealed that multi-ethnic empires based on ideology and force, rather than consent, are fundamentally unstable. These lessons seem obvious now, after the fact. But they were not obvious in 1960, when Soviet growth rates exceeded American ones, when Khrushchev's boasts seemed plausible, when many Western intellectuals believed socialism represented the future. The Soviet collapse changed the terms of political possibility. It ended the sense that there was a viable alternative to liberal democracy and market capitalism, what Francis Fukuyama famously called the end of history. That triumphalism proved premature history continues, and new challenges to liberal systems have emerged. But the Soviet collapse did settle certain questions about economic organization and political legitimacy that had been open throughout the 20th century. The final image is fitting. Empty pedestals where Lenin's statues once stood, physical erasure mirroring the psychological transformation. The Soviet Union did not just end politically, it ended in people's minds. The beliefs that sustained it, the narratives that justified it, the collective sense that history was moving toward communist triumph dissolved. What remains are the lessons of its failure. Warnings about the fragility of systems built on illusion, reminders that power without legitimacy eventually crumbles. proof that no amount of military force can substitute for the consent of the governed. The Soviet flag descended, and the world learned again what history keeps teaching, that human societies require some alignment between what they claim to be and what they actually are, that economic systems must deliver material goods alongside ideological promises, that political legitimacy cannot be manufactured through propaganda alone. The Soviet Union's collapse was neither purely economic nor purely psychological. It was the total failure of a system that could not adapt, because adaptation would have required admitting truths that destroyed the justification for the system's existence. In the end, it died because it could not bear to know itself.